Okay, so we're gonna start with this basic loop, and what I want you to do is write a loop that's going to display a table of Celsius temperatures from 0 to 20 and the Fahrenheit equivalent. So you can use that calculation to find out what the Fahrenheit equivalent is for Celsius. So do it for 0, do it for 1, do it for 2. So if you know that you're going from 0 to 20, what loop would be the best loop to use? 4. Yes, 4, great. So for loop to do this, so try to write a for loop to see if you can do this, and we'll take a few minutes to do that, and then I'll come and show you what I have, and you can compare what you have and see if you have any questions about it. So try to do this for the next couple of minutes, and then I'll come back together and talk about what you came up with, okay? All right, so let me show you what I have, and you can compare what you have to what I have. Okay, so even if you didn't get the table, hopefully you're able to get most of the for loop. And so for a table, they create labels for the table. So we're gonna have Celsius on one side, Fahrenheit on the other side. And then just to make it look nice, did a set precision of 1. You can choose how you want to display that if you had extra time to do that. But we're gonna have, this is the important part that I wanted to make sure everybody got. So if you're trying to go through all the Celsius temperatures from 0 to 20, then you want to start at 0. And then you want to go to less than equal to 20. So make sure you include 20 as well. And then count by 1. So Celsius plus means count by 1. So go 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 20. And then use the equation that I gave you. And you have to declare a variable Fahrenheit to be able to do it. And so I declared that up above. And you just put the equation in there. And if you use the Celsius variable here for your for loop, then you could just put Celsius right into your equation. And as this changes, then this changes as well. And then you can just display Celsius and Fahrenheit. And so each time you go through the for loop, the first time through the for loop, the Celsius would be 0, and then it would increment to 1. So the next time through it would be 1, and the next time through 2, and then 3, and then 4, all the way till 20. And so each time it would take that new Celsius and multiply it times 9 divided by 5. I put the point zeros in there so you get the decimal, because when you do 9 divided by 5, if you don't have decimals, you get 0 because it does integer division. So be careful that you at least have one of those as a decimal number. You don't have to have both, but one of them is a decimal number here, or it messes up your equation. And then hopefully it displays the right Celsius temperatures for you. The rest of this is just formatting, so you can always work on that later. But let's run it and see what happens. So you should get Celsius here and Fahrenheit here. So it goes 0 through 20 on the Celsius, and you should get the Fahrenheit and whatever number you decide to display. I did the formatting of decimals so you don't get like 16 decimal numbers. And so you can always go back and do that later if you didn't get a chance to do that. But did you all get something like that? It might not look exactly like mine, but did you come up with something like that? Anybody have any questions? Y'all feeling pretty good about it? Okay, great. Well, what I want to do is I want to talk to you just to make sure we get through this. I want to talk to you about nested loops. So we've gone over for loops, we've gone over while, we've gone over do while. When we're doing nested loops, it's really just putting a loop inside a loop, and normally we do that with for loops. And so we're going to do a program to kind of tell you what that is. But nested, we talked about nested conditional. It's just one conditional inside another conditional. So if you have an if statement, you put an if statement inside of there. So if you put a loop inside a loop, it's called a nested loop. All right. And so again, there's just an inner and outer. And so if you're doing this, you would need to make sure that you declare the row and the column if you're not going to do it here up above. Or you can just say int here and int here as well. So here, this one is going to say you go 1 through 3. So starting at 1, including 3, count by 1. And then you have an inner loop inside here, start at 1, go to 3. And so the outer one does the row, the inner one does the columns, and you draw kind of like a table. And we're going to actually do that today. So I'll show you what that looks like. So here is a more involved program. And so if you're trying to work on the number of students that you have in a class, the outer loop handles the number of students. So you can see start at student 1, go less than equal to the number of students you have in the class. So if you had like 25, you go to 25, including that. If you have 40, you go to 40, each time counting by ones. Okay. And then you set the total at 0. And then what happens is it does this inner loop. So when you have an inner loop, you have to do all of the inner loop before you come back out and go to the next outer loop iteration. So I like to tell students that I like to think of it as like one of those amusement park rides, like where you have the teacups. You see the teacup ride where you have the teacups that spin like this, and then you have the outer platform that spins. And so each time the outer platform goes around, the inner cups spin. And so think of like the cup, the teacup is like the inner loop that spins, you know, maybe 5 times each time you go around. And then the outer platform as the outer loop. So think about like inner and outer. So you're going to go through the test for each student. So when you're on student 1, this one is going to increment through all the tests for that student. And then you're going to move to student 2 and increment through all the tests. And so however many tests you have, it'll go to a number of tests each time by 1. And so you'll enter the score. And this is for student 1. And then it'll add to the total. And then it'll keep going through those tests for that one student until it gets through all the tests. So if you put 10 tests, it's going to go through all 10 tests before it comes and it does the average for that student. And then it's going to move to the next student. And so what it's doing is doing student by student, all the tests for that one particular student. And so when you get to the inner loop, it has to go through that and finish, and that condition has to become false before it goes to the anything else in your loop, and it comes back up to the next iteration of the outer loop. And then when it gets to the next iteration of the outer loop, it gets stuck in the inner loop again, and it has to finish the inner loop before it goes back to the outer loop. And so it takes a little bit of practice trying to work through those. But again, just think when you get an inner loop, it has to finish all iterations of that. And then when it finishes that and that becomes false, then it pops out, does anything else in the outer loop. And then it comes to the next iteration of the outer loop, and then it gets stuck in there again and it has to finish. And so just think like one student can do all the tasks. So that would be the inner loop, and then go to the next student and do all the tasks. But each time you're also printing, and when you're finished with all the tasks, you're printing the average for that student as well, and then go to the next student. Okay. And so how many repetitions would it be? You multiply the outer loop times the inner loop, and that tells you how many times it'll go through. So you have to figure out, like, if you have 25 students, okay, and you have 10 tests, then you would multiply the 25 times the 10, and that's how many times it will go through. Okay. We don't use these as often, but if you remember from when we had the switch statement, we had something called a break. We also have a break and a loop. And so if you ever want to get out of a loop, you can break at a certain point. So you can actually put like a condition in there, like if this is true, break, and it'll break out of the for loop for you. So I don't use continue as much. Continue means instead of breaking out of the loop completely, it actually goes to the next iteration of the loop. And so it skips that iteration. And so again, we don't use it too often, but every once in a while we want to put it in there. So the break out completely. So if something became invalid for some reason, then you might want to break out of the loop completely. So you just put an if statement in your loop, and then you would have just the word break with a semicolon, and it would break out. If you want to skip that particular iteration, like let's say you don't want it to be included for a certain reason, then you would say continue, and everything else in the loop would get skipped, and it will go to the next iteration of the loop. And so it won't break out, it'll just skip it. It's like a skip. Okay. And we're going to get to this next class. So I'm going to stop there with the slides. And what I want to do is actually show you an example with the nested loops. And then we can talk about that break and continue. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my code here. And if y'all want to do this with me so you have it as an example, we are going to do a new example. And so I'll erase all this. And this one is going to be a nested loop. I'm going to put nested loop. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to print out some symbol. We can do like an X's, or we can do asterisks or something. But we're going to print out some symbol. Okay, so what we're going to do is we are going to first do a for loop. And we're going to start with a row, and we're going to see how that looks. So we're going to start with a row, and we'll start with row equals 1. So int row equals 1. Row is last end, whatever number you want. So we'll put 10 in there for now. Okay. And then we'll do row plus plus. Okay. Now you're going to want to put curly braces so you can keep track of where the loop starts and ends. And you can put that curly brace, that starting curly brace on the same line or on the next line. but then it just indent the code inside of there. And what we're going to do is we're just going to pick a symbol that we want to print. So I can print like X's, for example, or you can print whatever symbol you want to print. And we're just going to see how that looks right now. So we just did the rows. We just did one loop. We didn't do the nested loop yet, but let's just see how this looks. See if that works. Okay, so I should get 10 X's across. And I didn't do end line, so they're all on one line. Okay, so does everybody understand that code so far? I mean, actually, I get 9 because I didn't include it, right? Okay. Equal to 10 if I want to include it. I'm used to starting at 0, and if I start at 0, then I go less than. But we don't really have a reason to start at 0 right now because we haven't talked about arrays. But when we get to arrays, there's a reason for starting at 0, but for right now, it doesn't make sense why we start at 0, so I should probably start at 1, just to not confuse anyone. But when we talk about arrays, we'll talk about why it might be a good option to start at 0. So if you're starting at 1, like we normally count in everyday life, then you have to go less than equal to include the last number. So if you want to go, 10 X's, then you want to go less than equal to 10 to include it. Because if you go less than 10, you only get 9. Does that make sense to everybody? Everybody get 10? Okay. So now we can add a nested one and see how it looks. So we understand this one, right? Everybody's good? So we're going to go inside that loop and we're going to hit enter. And we're going to add another loop. This is going to be the inner loop. And so this is going to handle the columns. And so we're going to do 4, and we're going to call this column. You could call it C if you don't feel like typing column. But in case you forget, I'm going to write out the word column. But, C, column, either way is fine. Okay, we're going to start at 1, and we're going to say column is less than equal to whatever number you want to start at. So if you want to do 10 by 10, we could do 10 by 10 the first time, and we could change it. And then we'll just say column plus plus. Okay, now technically you don't need to put the curly braces if you don't want to, because this line will be included, or you can put them in there if you want to. That's a lot of curly braces, but if you want them, it would look something like that, but you don't need to have them if you don't want to. Okay, now we're gonna have a problem with this because we're trying to do the inner loop, but we're not putting any enters. So what's gonna happen is we're gonna print 10 X's, but then we're never jumping to the next line. And so if we run it like right now, we're gonna have a bunch of X's. Actually, what did I do? Let's see. Oh, it helps if I put a parenthesis there. Sorry, if you didn't put a parenthesis there, please put a parenthesis here. I missed that somehow. But it looks like garbage because there's a bunch of X's across the screen. And really what I wanted to do was I wanted to print 10 and I wanted to jump to the next line and then print 10 and jump to the next line. So I wanted to do a 10 by 10 grid so that I would have 10 rows and 10 columns. But I ended up with a bunch of X's across. I got how many I'm supposed to have, but it didn't print the way I wanted it to print because I don't have any end lines here. And if I put an end line here, I'm going to get X's straight down the whole way. And that's going to be a problem too. So I'm going to add something and then I'll explain why. I'm going to put the end line down here and then I'm going to show you that that works and then we'll talk about why that works. But it has to be inside this for loop from here to here. It has to be inside this outer for loop and outside of the inner for loop. So this line is outside of this inner for loop, but inside of the outer for loop. And so if you run it, it should give you a 10 by 10. So if you count how many rows and how many columns, you should have 10 by 10, hopefully. Did it not work? You don't need them. Well, actually, you shouldn't because let me take them off. You do need them for the outer though, because you have two things. You're trying to do this extra line here. Only this line should be included with this. Does it not work if you take it off? It might be confusing if you do it because this line's included and this line's not. I recommend it. I think it'll work without it, but I recommend it because here's what happens. This looks confusing, but I think it still works. Let's see though. Yeah, it just looks confusing. And if you indent this, then it looks like it's included, but it's not included because remember, only one line gets included with this for loop. And then this line won't be included, but I don't want it to be included, but it looks really strange because it looks like this is not included, but this is, and it looks like maybe it was a mistake. It looks like maybe, so I think it's better. You can leave them off, but I think it's better to have them because then you're telling people exactly, I meant to just include this and not include this. So people aren't like, did you forget to indent that? Is that supposed to be included? Did you forget curly braces? But I was purposely not including that line inside there. So I like the curly braces in that case, but yeah, you don't need them, but it makes the code, I think, a little trickier to not have them. I think lots of people put them just to, so you know exactly what belongs with it and what doesn't belong. Because when you leave them off again, if you go add a line of code later, it doesn't work because it's not included, or people aren't sure like what's supposed to be included and what's not supposed to be included. That tells people I purposely just included this. Okay, so what happens is we are starting here and we are on the first row. So this is your first row. So you're thinking like rows as across, okay? And we're doing the columns as straight down, right? So we're doing horizontal and vertical. So first we're starting with a row. So this is going to be row 1, okay? And then what you're doing is you're telling it to go in here. This is column 1, this very first X you're doing here, and you're telling it to draw an X, right? And then you're telling it to come up here. You're not getting out of this inner loop. You're telling it to come up here and increment, so draw another X. And then come increment, draw another X. And then come increment. And you're doing that 10 times, and that's how you wind up with this. This inner loop is how you wind up with the 10 X's across. And I know it's called columns because you're thinking like column, column, column. Column is down your vertical, but it's you're drawing an X and drawing an X, and those are your columns. But that whole thing is your row. Like that's considered row 1. Does everybody see that? Like row and column. Okay, so once you handle all the columns for row 1, then you're going to enter and jump to the next line. So that's why this is outside of the for loop, because we don't want to enter every time because you would get X's down this way vertically. And we don't want to do that until we're finished with the whole row. And so we do this end line here because what happens is once you're finished with all the columns for this row, then we do an end line and you move to the next one, right? Now, when you move to the next one, you switch the row here because you increment. So you were row 1, now you're row 2, right? And then you come down and you do all the columns for that row, right? And then you jump to the next line and you increment the row, and then you do all the columns for that row. And so the nice thing is, though, I can just change this number here. It doesn't have to be the same. Like the number of rows and columns don't have to be the same. Like I can do 5 rows and 10 columns. Or I can do, you know, the other way around. Whatever numbers you want for those, it'll do. Like it doesn't matter if they're the same. But I can easily adjust these. I can make this whatever I want. The number of rows, remember, is how many you have this way, horizontal. And the number of columns is how many X's you have. Does that make sense to everybody? Are you envisioning that? Okay. So what I could do is I could like ask the user how many rows, how many columns if I wanted to, just to kind of make it a little more interesting. But one problem with that is if I ask them how many rows and how many columns, they could give me like a negative number, and then that wouldn't work right for my loops. And so we could validate it, which is something we learned how to do and everybody knows how to do, right? So we can ask the user how many, you know, rows you would like to have. And so we could say something like, okay, we're going to save it in a variable called, we can't call it row because we already have a variable called row. So we could call it like num row or something like that. Or, you know, we can't call it number because we'll have one for row and one for columns. So we call it like num row and num columns, if that makes sense. So we're going to have a variable called num row. And then we'll have one called num columns. Call it, okay? And then what we're going to do is ask the user, how many rows do you want? So how many rows would you like? Enter a positive number. And if they say 0, that's fine. I mean, it just won't do anything, right? Because if it's 0, then it's not going to print that. Okay, so, and then we're going to take in that and we're going to put that in the number of rows. Okay. Now, this is fine, right? And we could do the same thing for columns. Now, when I'm doing this, this variable would get used right here in place of 5. Does everybody see that? So I would use num row here in place of 5. Does everybody understand that so far? Okay, and then I could do the same thing because I create another variable called number of columns. I could do the same thing for number of columns, just call this num column and then say, how many columns would you like? And then I do the same thing here. Instead of having 10, I would put num column, right? Now, again, I didn't do any validation with this. So if you enter negative numbers, then that's just not something you should enter. But we can validate in just a minute. So let's run it and see if it works though with our loops. Like if you enter a 2, 4, does that work? Enter whatever numbers you want in there and see if you got the grid that looks like whatever 2 numbers you entered. Then again, they don't have to be the same numbers. So that's why I did 1 for row and 1 for columns. But it doesn't validate. So if you enter negative numbers, that's just not going to work, right? So did everybody get that? And does that make sense to everybody? I put these variables here, and then I use these variables for my loop to see, instead of having an actual number there, I use the variables so that you get to decide how many times you want the loop to execute. Is that making sense to everybody? Is okay with that part before I validate these numbers? And then the problem is that you may not get a positive number, even though you told them you wanted a positive number. And so that's the next part I want to solve. But before I solve that, is everybody okay with this? Okay. So what I want to do is I want to validate this. So we'll take this first one first. And what I want to do is you can use a while or a do while. I like the do while, but you can use a while. So let's start with a while and we'll redo it if you want the do while. So we say while here, because when they enter this, if it's not right, then I need to ask them again, right? But I don't want an if statement because that only works one time, right? So I want a while statement or a while, loop, because I want it to repeat as many times as needed. So if they keep entering wrong numbers, then they're going to keep having to do it. Now, if I'm allowing 0, then I would just do the numbers that are less than 0. Like while the num row is less than 0, because that means that it's invalid, right? Then I want to repeat and I want to have them do it again. And so I'm going to put my curly braces here for my loop, and I'm just going to do this again. I'm going to do it once here, and then I'm going to do it again here. So if you're entering a number less than 0, then we're going to ask you again. What happens if you don't enter a number less than 0? Well, then this doesn't happen, because you're fine, and it skips all of this. So we'll skip this if it's not true. Yes.
Why are you using num in the while?
Oh yeah, I don't know, because I'm half asleep today. I think I would know when I hit run. Like, this is why testing is important, because sometimes I feel like we overlook simple things, like we're doing it and then we're like, why did that happen? Because like we run it and we're like, oh, I didn't put the right variable name, like, or I didn't put my parenthesis on my for loop, because it's like, sometimes we think like we're reading it and we're just looking and that looks good, and then you're like, oh no, that's not good. Okay, so yes, perfect, thank you. So it should be num row, because I have 2 variables. I have another one for num column. So then if you enter a negative number, different negative numbers, and then you enter a positive number, you should be okay. The second one doesn't work for that because we didn't do that yet. So we have to do that. And it's fine to use a while loop. I'm fine with the while loop. I just think it's a lot of repetition. And so instead of doing this, because it's kind of, extra code, I would just change this to a do while. I would eliminate this, and I would just make this. I would take this, I would move it down here, put a semicolon, oops, not in place of it, but put a semicolon at the end, and then put the word do here. And then that's the same code. And you can put these curly braces on separate lines if you want to, or you could leave them condensed like that. And I like that because that's a little less to look at, and it still works. Once you have the logic for the one loop, you can easily just, copy that for the other one. Just make sure you use num column instead of num row. So if you like the while loop, go ahead and use the while loop for the second one. And if you like the do while, go ahead and use the do while for the second one, whatever one you want. Yes.
Downside doing it this way is that you can give like user feedback, right?
Yeah, you can give user feedback. So you're just hoping that if they see it enough, they'll figure out what the problem is. Yeah. Yeah, you can't put invalid, because if you put invalid, it shows up on the first time and it's not invalid. And then you could add an if statement, but if you're going to add an if statement, then you might as well just go with a while loop because you're just adding extra code. So like the purpose of why I chose the do while is because I didn't want to add extra code. So if I'm going to go ahead and add if statements in there for error messages, then I kind of defeated the purpose of using the do while. But yeah, if you can't put a error message in there because they didn't error on the first time. They may not have errored on the first time. With the do while, we don't know if they're going to get it right the first time. If they do, it won't repeat. But if they don't, it'll repeat. But we can't, there's no way to say like invalid because on the first time it will also say invalid unless we put like an if statement that says like if it's less than 0, display error message. And then we're adding extra code. So yeah, you get the same message every time. But you hope that if your directions are clear enough and people keep entering numbers and it's not working, that they figure it out. So it just depends on how involved it is. And if it's something you need to explain more, then yeah, you probably want to go with while and put like a more detailed error message in there. But hopefully like they'll read like enter positive number and they'll be like, oh, okay. Like, after a couple mess ups, I need to fix that. But yeah, you're completely right. That's one of the downsides is you can't really put an error message without putting another if statement. Okay. So completely up to you. You should know how to do both ways so that if you did want to do, and make sure this is called, if you did want to do an error message, a while loop would probably be a better option. And so then in that case, you'd want to do it. I just like this one if you're not going to change or add error messages. And then this one, if you structure, make sure you do num column if you're using that same condition or copy and pasting. So then if you enter negative numbers for both, it should ask you to enter positive number over and over again. Are y'all feeling pretty comfortable with the while and do while now in the for loop? A little bit, kind of. Hopefully you'll have a lot of examples. So if you want to, if you have this working, if you can save this, and then that way you have example of validating. This one's validating a negative number, making sure you're not having a negative number. And then it has the nested loops in there with the for loop. If you can understand that, I'm sure basic for loops are pretty easy, but it might take you a while to kind of get the flow of the nested loops because you really have to follow and make sure you're only doing this once, and then you're doing all of these and finishing executing this before you go and increment the outer loop again. Okay, so go ahead and save this. So you have it and give it a name like nested loops maybe, because that was the point of it. That the extra validation was just extra to make sure everybody knew how to do that. So call it nested loop so you have it saved and you know that this is the one with the loop inside the loop. That was the main point of this. And then we're going to do another program together. We'll keep doing programs until everybody's got it. Right? Okay. Everybody got that saved? We are going to, it's not too much to type. I was going to give it to you, but let's go ahead and type it. I think it's better to type it sometimes and we could go step by step. So let's go ahead and erase what we have in there. And we're going to call this guessing game. And we can do this various ways. You can even change it later if you want as a challenge. You can kind of think of which may make sense to you and you can modify it however you want. So one of the first things you need with a guessing game is a random number. Okay, and you need to decide if you're doing like a random number, 1 through 10 or 1 through 100 or what you're doing. Okay, we are going to add like too high or too low. So I think 1 through 100 is okay. If you're not going to do like too high or too low, 1 through 100 would probably take forever to figure it out. And then 1 through 10 might be a better game. But because we're going to add too high or too low, I think 1 through 100 is reasonable. And so we're going to create a random number first off. And so we'll do like random num, and then we'll say, this is the equation I like to use. Actually, I have to do one thing first. I have to do the seed. So you have to do unsigned seed equals time 0. And then you have to say srand with the seed. Or you can actually just put this inside of here where it says seed if you want to. it might be overwhelming, but if you want to do that and eliminate that extra line, what I have highlighted here, time parentheses 0, like this can go right where seed is here and srand, and then you wouldn't need to create that extra variable called seed. That's really up to you. Either way is fine. And then you can use the random number. So you can say random number equals 1 plus rand, because if you just do, and then do modulus 100, if you just do rand like this, without doing the seed for srand, then you'll always get the same random number. And so that wouldn't be good. So that'd be a boring game. So we need to make sure we get a different random number. And then just to make sure it's working, we should probably print it out because I want to make sure that it is giving me a random number. So I'm just going to print out the random number. Okay. And if you want to put like a little label here so you know what it is, random number. But we're going to take this off anyways because it wouldn't be good to give people the random number before you ask them what the random number is. So this is just for now for testing purposes. So random number 26. Make sure your random number is 1 through 100. So run it a bunch of times. Sometimes you might get the same number. It's okay. But just make sure if you run it a bunch of times, you don't keep getting the same number. So again, this is for testing purposes right now because I want to be able to know what the random number is. And then when you want someone to play the game, we'll comment out that line so it doesn't give them the answer. But for now, I have that in there because I don't really want to play the game. I just want to make sure my game works. So for testing purposes, we need to make sure we're getting a number 1 to 100 because that wouldn't be fair game if we weren't getting a number 1 to 100. Does everybody have that? And does that make sense so far? Okay, so now we have a random number. And then we need to ask the user to guess a number between 1 and 100. So we are going to ask them to guess a number. So we need to create a variable to save their number into. So like int num. And then we can ask them to explain the directions. So guess a number between 1 and 100. And you can also say including 1 and 100 if you want to, but you can say inclusive, but it's including those numbers, 1 and 100. Okay. And you can put like a little space here, or you may want to do like an end L and put it on the next line. It's really up to you. That one I might put on the next line. I don't like it when I ask them to enter numbers and it ends up against another number that I have, like 100. And so I'll put it on the next line. And then I'll take in, now I might change this name num here to guess because I don't want you to confuse it with a random number. So I'm going to change this just because I was looking at this up here. I know it says random num, but if I have random num and num, it might be confusing which ones, you know, when you're looking back, you might think like the num is the random number. So I'm going to change it to guess just because I think it makes more sense and it makes it easy to understand the program. So I changed my variable name up here to guess because I was rethinking that, and then I put guess down here. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so now go ahead and run it. Make sure you're okay so far. It should tell you random number, and then look, I made a mistake, and so it's always good to run. I did not put an end L or a backslash n here, and so this ends up on the same line. And so I don't like that. That's bothering me. I know it's 86. I just put a guess in there, but I'm going to go ahead and fix that right now. So if I want that on a new line, I'm going to put backslash n here. Okay, so backslash n is also the same thing as end L. So then I can run it again to make sure that works. And then I don't get that on the same line. So again, always great to test. And it doesn't do anything yet, but always good to test. Make sure everything is spelled correctly, looks okay, and is working so far. So everybody's working so far? Okay, now, if they don't enter a guess between 1 and 100, then we should probably tell them that that's not a number between 1 and 100. So I think it's good to validate because if they're entering 200, well, then they're never going to get it right because it's not meeting their criteria. And so I think it's good right now to validate this and say, is that between 1 and 100? And if not, ask them to guess the number, say the number has to be between 1 and 100. So you have to make a decision because we were talking about this before. You can either go with a do while or you can go with a while because the for loop doesn't make sense because that would mean you know how many times they're going to make a mistake. So we either go with while or do well. While is great for validation if you want to put like a catered error message in here. So like if you're asking them to guess the number between 1 and 10, 1 and 100, maybe they're not following the rules, and maybe you do need to say that number is not between 1 and 100. Okay, maybe you need another message. So in that case, I would go with while. If you're just going to repeat the same directions, then you would just go with do while. You would just change this to a do while. Does that difference make sense, everybody? You get to decide as the programmer. Do you need catered directions with it? And in that case, we'll try that this time. We'll try a while. Then you would put a while here. And so after they're guessing, while their guess is not between 1 and 100. So there's a couple of different ways to do that. You can put the criteria for what is 1 to 100. Like when your guess is between 1 and 100, and then put an exclamation point in front of it, and then it would be the opposite of that. Or you can go with what is the opposite of 1 and 100. So if you're doing what's the opposite, I want you to see if you can think of that for a minute and come up with that, and then I'll give it to you. So you come up with either way and try to redo. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to use the guess. We have to put guess here. And we want to know if the number is not between 1 and 100. So again, you could come up with the criteria that is between 1 and 100, and then put an exclamation point in front of it, but that's not typically what makes the most sense to people. So if you want to do the opposite, you could do less than equal to 0, or you could do less than 1, because we would know that 0 would also less than 1 and anything less than that. So you could say, no, but that only includes criteria that is too small, but that doesn't include criteria that's too large. So then we also want to include criteria that would be greater than 100. So do I want to put an and or an or here? It seems like and, but it's actually or, because you can't have a guess that is less than 1 and greater than 100 at the same time. So that's the confusing part. So whenever it's between 1 and 100, it's and. But whenever it's opposite, like if this is too small or too large, it's one or the other. It can't be both, because there's no such number that is less than 1 and greater than 100 at the same time. But if you're saying for a number that's between, if you ever use the word between, that's and. But if you're using like opposites, then it's or. Does that make sense to everybody? So use the straight up and down lines, which we don't use often, but it's the key above the enter, shift and the key above the enter. And then we want to do guesses greater than 100. Be careful, because you have to repeat the variable name here. You can't just put greater than 100, because even though you were using guess on the left side of the or, doesn't mean that you're still using it on the right. So C++ wants you to repeat the name of the variable on the right side of the or. So what you're comparing. And then we just repeat this again. Now, you can choose, because we were talking about this before, you can choose to put some sort of error message here, like instead of repeating the same thing, because apparently they didn't get your directions the first time. So you might want to put some other message here that says like, your number was not between 1 and 100. Please try again. Okay. Whatever you want to say. And I can probably erase this. I mean, or you could say it again if you think you need to. But what you can say that at that point, you can actually say that their number is not between 1 and 100, because we used a while instead of a do well. If you use a do well, you wouldn't want to say your number is not between 1 and 100, because that would be their first time guessing. And that would be weird to say you're incorrect and you didn't even guess yet. And then we want to try it and make sure it works. So let's try something that's not between 1 and 100. So let's try like -1. Okay, 0, because 0 is not included. And then we'll try something 101. Then I'll try 1. Okay, so you have to keep guessing till you try a number that's between 1 and 100, hopefully. So run that a couple times and make sure that works. Does it look okay? Do you like the spacing? Do you like the enters? Does everybody's work? Does it make sense? Okay, now we get to the fun part. Now we get to decide if their guess. Now we know their guess is between 1 and 100, and we're not moving on until it is. Now we can actually decide if they guessed the right number. Now, because we're going to actually tell them they're too high or too low, and then we're going to guess again. we are going to create another loop underneath this, not inside of this, because this means that they're incorrect. So we're going to create another loop. Now, we don't know how many times it's going to take them to guess. So would we use while or for loop? Which one's better, while or for loop, do you think? So for typically we know how many times. And so while we don't know how many times, because we have no idea. They could guess it right on the first time, right? They could be correct. Or they could take 10 times, or they could take 20. Who knows how many times it's going to take them? So for, it means I would know how many times that they're going to take. But while means I don't know how many times they're going to take. Now, we can structure this different ways. We can use while or we can use do while. Okay. Now, they've already entered a guess. And so in this case, we probably want to use while because they've already entered a guess. Like we already established that they entered a guess. Now, part of the problem is that if we put the while down here and they guess again, we don't have our validation in there, right? We do our guessing again. So we would need to think about how we want to structure this because we want to rewrite code, or how do we want to do this? Because if we do here, let me show you. If we handle this while guess is, how do we know that they didn't get it right? We don't use this one that much. But does anybody remember the symbol for not?
Exclamation mark.
Yes, not equal to is exclamation point equals. And so we'll say random number. What was that? It's rand number, I think. Random number. I wrote it out. Random num. I just wrote num though, not number. Okay. So if we do this, okay, we're gonna put curly braces here and a curly brace here. Okay. Now, we can easily say that, okay, if they're in here, we could say you're not correct, right? Guess again, but we want to tell them if they're too high or too low. So we can put if guess is less than the random number, because we know they're not right because we got into the while loop. Okay. Then we know that that's too low. Your number is no, that is too low. Okay. And you can put a backslash n if you want, or an end line. And then otherwise, let's say else if guess is greater than number, random number. I'm just stuck on number. Okay. Then that's too high. I'll just type it. So, and you don't need to have curly braces for the if and the else if. If you want to, you can, but there's only one statement. So you can put them if you want to. Sorry, that is too high. However you want to word that. Oops, I need a quote there. Okay. All right. Now, this, if you guess incorrectly, is going to become an infinite loop, right? Because there's no way to re-enter a guess. And so if you enter a guess that's not equal to random number, it's never going to be equal to random number because it just keeps coming back up and not being equal, right? Because there's no way to change it. Once you get in this loop, there's no way to get out of this loop right now. Because this criteria never changes. Does that make sense to everybody? That never changes. So it's going to stay like that. So we need to have them enter their guess again. If we simply just do this, it could be an invalid guess. If we say guess again, you put and take in the guess. That's a way to get out of the loop, right? But it could be an invalid guess. But I mean, the first time through, we already told them the directions, so you can decide if you need to tell them again. But let's just test this and then we can fix it. So if we run it. Okay, so we know the answer because we're cheating, right? We know it's 61. So I'm going to guess a number that's lower than that. I'm just going to guess 50. and it should say it's too low, right? And then I'm going to guess the number higher. So 78. That should say it's too high. We know the number is 61, so we can guess 61 and see if it stops. And it doesn't do anything else, right? So it would be nice if maybe we came out after this loop and we said like, congratulations, so that when they do it, you guessed it. Because they're going to keep playing till they get it right. So the only way to get here is for them to guess it, because the only way to stop this loop is for them to get it right, right? So the only way to get to this line right now is to guess. Oh, I forgot to put my quotes. Is to get it right. So if you keep guessing wrong numbers, you keep guessing, right? But then when you guess the right number, and you know what the right answer is because it's right here, then it's going to tell you, congratulations, she guessed it, hopefully. Okay, now we can restructure this program because I'm having a little problem with you're not really validating this. Does everybody see that? But you're validating it up here. So we have to think about how we want to do this. My favorite way would be like a do-while where they go ask them and then it like kind of goes through, just because I always tend to go to do-while. But you don't have to do it that way. There's so many ways you can do it. But we want to include this within here. Now, you can also just add this to here if you want to. But you would need to make, well, this could just go in there, right? Because well, we're doing it the first time. So after, you know, here, but then you would go through. I'm gonna move this, and you tell me if you like it, and if you don't, you can restructure it. I'm gonna move this down here. Oops, I always do that. Okay. And then I'm gonna change this to a do. Whoop, maybe. And then I'm just gonna have them, okay, so do this, but I need to give them the directions. So if your guess is, you can just change the criteria here. So if your guess, let's see, we want to ask them for your random number. Okay, so, oops. Guess a number between 1 and 100, taking the guess. Okay, why your guess is not equal. So I can erase this down here because I'm moving it up to the top and checking at the bottom. But that still doesn't validate, right? I'm not validating. So what I need to do is I need to have them. It's not. Wow. Actually, no, because I'm not guessing, right? So hold on a sec, guys. I'm losing my mind. Do well guess is okay. So I don't want to just do an if else. I was thinking about just doing an if else, but then they if I do an if else, it only does it one time, but then it wouldn't be equal. So I guess it would do and ask them to guess again. That's actually that works. Because if we just do an if else, instead of okay, so if we just do an if else here, guess is less than 1, then that's gonna be, and this is gonna be an else if, right? If guess is less than 1, then we want just tell them that's not between, or that's too low. You can actually just say that's too low, I guess. But you could say that's not between 1 and 100 if you want to say that same thing. Let's try again. Okay. And then what if your guess is too high? Then I would put that here, else if technically just telling them they're too high or too low, I guess works too, but they maybe need to know that they're not even close because they're not even in the right range. So we're just giving them extra information. So I'm just reposting this. So if your guess is less than 1, it's still not going to be equal to random number. So it's still going to come back up and do it again. So this can then go away. That's why I like the do well, because I don't have to repeat it. But I mean, technically, you don't have to really do this. You could just leave it as too low or too high. I mean, if they're entering 200, that's way too high. But I'm just trying to give them that they're not even in the ballpark. And so technically, it should be like, okay, if I'm entering 200, it should tell me your number is not between 1 and 100. Please try again. Guess the number between 1 and 100. Negative. I'm just trying to give them a separate direction, and you don't have to, as to they're not even in the right range. But if I enter a number that's in the right range, like I know the number is 26, but if I enter a number too high, it should tell me too high. So at least I'm in the range. Like I'm trying to get out to tell them that they're not in the right range. And then I enter a number too low, tells me it's too low. And then when does it stop? Well, when you enter the right number. And then it only gets to this part here whenever you get out of this loop from here to here. I'm going to see if I can put that on the screen. Okay. So here's the loop from here to here. This is our do while loop. This keeps happening as long as it's not equal to the random number. And if it's out of the range, it's still not equal to the random number. If this is too wordy, you can like reword it to say out of range or something. Also, because this is the same, you can also put your or back there and not do it twice if you want to. Like if you want to say if guess is less than 1, or like we were saying this before, and I put 2 different things, but you can also say guess is greater than 100. Whether you want spaces here is up to you, but I don't really need to repeat this again because that's kind of that's the same message, unless you were going to say that number is less than 1 and shouldn't be. If you're going to say something related to the less than 1, then you need to have 2 separate ones. But if you're going to just say both things, then you can just put them in one like that. Does that make sense to everybody? Just kind of condensing, trying to think of the best way to condense. And again, leaving and it's just these 2 options would have been fine, because it is too high or too low, even if it's out of range. I'm just trying to handle the out of range numbers because I don't like it being out of range because they're not even following the rules. But if you follow the rules, then you should get too low or too high. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So you can restructure this any way you want. You don't really have to do the validation because as I was saying before, it's okay to just do too low or too high. So if you wanted to restructure it as a while loop, you can also restructure this program as a for loop and break out of it when you get it correct. So like if you think like, okay, they could guess like 100 times and still not, I mean, hopefully not because you're telling them too high or too low. So they should be able to break it down as to, I mean, if you split the tree, if you guess 50, even if I didn't have the actual random number up there, because, you know, let's see, like, I'm going to comment this out because I don't want it to tell me the actual number. And let's say I'm actually playing the game. Well, I probably wouldn't guess 1 because if I guess 1, I'm not really helping with, you know, like eliminate some numbers. So I always guess like halfway, like 50, because if that's too low, then I can eliminate all numbers 1 through 50 because I kind of split it in half. So if I know that's too low, then I would go half again. So I guess like 75. Okay. I wouldn't guess like 51 because that doesn't really help. I mean, maybe unless I have like this feeling that it's 51, because I really don't know what it is, right? So 75 is too high. Now I know it's between 51 and 74. And so it kind of helps split it. Does everybody see this idea? And then you can kind of guess the number quicker if you do that. You're not really going with like a feeling of you feel like it's the number. I'm just actually trying to guess it the quickest that I can. So then I would guess the number between 51 and 74. So maybe I have a feeling this time, but I'm going to go with a number in the middle. That's like, okay, I'm thinking it's 70, maybe. No, too high. So now I know it's between 51 and 69, right? Is everybody good? So I have to keep guessing. So no, too low. So now it's 61 and 69. Okay, good. I got it. So, but I could be here all day if I keep guessing 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Because I'm not really eliminating much of it unless I just happen to guess the right number. But one thing you might want to do is have a for loop that only goes 5 times and say like you only get 5 guesses. And then what you would do inside the for loop is you would say like if the guess equals the right number, break out. And you would have break and it would break out of it instead of doing like a keep going as long as you get it right. So if we wanted to like rewrite it that way, we would kind of you want to copy this and save it so you have this version. Is everybody with me? Copy this and save it before we change it. Okay, I can print them. Let me get another one. I can print the different examples for you. But if you have it working, go ahead and save it, please. If it's not working, then I can print it and give it to you and you can have it work later. And you can keep playing with this. Keep playing with this to get this the way you want. This is a good program to play around with because there's so many different ways to write it. And you can come up with like what you think the best way is and what you like. And what wording you like and how you want to do it, it'd be fine. So if you wanted to do a for loop, let's just say we wanted to change this and want to do like for loop, we'll do like I equals 1. You don't have to change this. You could just watch if you want. If you want to do another program after you saved it, you can. I is less than equal to, let's say you only get 5 tries, right? We could call this try if you want, instead of I, but I plus plus, okay? So we have this, we have this for loop that we're going to do. Erase this. Okay. Now, we don't know if they're going to get it right when they come out of the loop because they only get 5 tries. So we're going to say if, okay. If the number, the guess, is equal to the random number, then we're going to break out and we know that we got it right. But I'm also going to say here, congratulations, because otherwise I won't know that they got it right. So I'm going to copy this right here because if I leave that down there, it's going to say congratulations. And they may not have gotten it right because this game is limiting how many tries they get because they're only getting 5 tries. Does that make sense? So for loop means you only get however many you say it goes. It doesn't go until it stops. Now, part of the problem with this is, okay, so guess a random number. Part of the problem with this is that what happens if you get it right on the first time? Okay, so let's say we run this and let me put my thing back in so I'm cheating. But I don't want to play the game, really. I want to know what it is. So I'm cheating again. So 63. Let's say that I guess it on the first time. Actually, let me guess it wrong the first. That one's too low, right? And then make sure the too high works, and then we'll guess it right. Okay, so that's great. Actually, let me go through. Let me show you that it works for 5. So what happens if I keep guessing incorrectly? I know it's 63. I'm going to guess 5 times incorrectly, and it should stop me. I know it's 63. So do you see how I didn't get to keep guessing? I only got to do it 5 times. And I never did get the right answer because I know I cheated and I know it was 63. So I got to guess 5 times, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but I never did get it right? Because I really wasn't looking at the too high, I was just guessing numbers. I should be able to get it right with 5 tries, or you can up it to more if you want. But what happens if I get it right on the first try? Because I know that works. So let's say I get it right. Oh, actually, because it breaks. That's okay. Yeah, because I put the break in there. Never mind. I'm good. You can also add a condition up here if you wanted. You can say, or you guess it right. And then it would also stop. So you can add, I wanted to talk about the break. That's why I put that in there. Because we just talked about break and continue. I don't use continue too often. Continue would mean that you want to skip that particular iteration, but keep going with the loop, but it doesn't really work for this example. So I can do like a basic example on Wednesday, but I wanted this one to actually make sense for an actual situation. So if I guess it right on the first, second, third, like I know it's 48 because I'm still cheating. So if I guess too high and then I guess 48, it should stop and tell me I'm right. But I only get 5 tries, so I may not ever get it. Does that make sense to everybody? And then when you're ready to give this to someone, you would take out this line and not cheat, right? Okay, so if you want to save that, I know it was kind of quick because I know it's the end of class, but if you want to save that as an example, I can print it for anyone that got lost in there. And then if you just want to mess with it and do whatever you want to do with it, I think this is a good game to mess with and try out your different loops, try out your different conditionals to get it the way you want. You may not like the way I did it. Then this would be great to practice with. But otherwise, I am done.